In the last video, we talked about how the Fed could increase the money supply, and now we're going to talk about how the Fed can decrease the money supply. The good news is, if you've learned how the Fed can increase the money supply, then decreasing it is pretty easy. It's basically moving in reverse. Decreasing the money supply. Okay, so in no particular order here, we could start with any of them, but why don't we just use the order we were using before. If we wanted to increase the money supply, we would do open market purchases. The Fed would buy stuff, usually Treasury securities. If the Fed wants to decrease the money supply, they only need to go the other direction. So rather than making open market purchases, the Fed can make open market sales. And this is just when the Fed sells anything. And this is typically Treasury securities, governmental bonds. The logic of this is when the Fed makes open market sales, for example, if it sells a security for $100,000, it can then take that money and destroy it. Okay? So the Fed goes out there and it sells some of the securities that it has and then destroys the money that it has from that sale. So that can be done to decrease the money supply. This is pretty easy. The only caveat I would say about this is open market purchases are really easy. The Fed can just buy anything they want. Open market sales are a little bit different and a little bit more difficult because they have to have the items already. Meaning the Fed can't sell something it doesn't have. So for the Fed to engage in open market sales, it should have already done open market purchases in the past. So this is a bit limited in that sense. Right now the Fed has something like $2 trillion in assets. So it could sell all those assets, but then it would run out. It wouldn't be able to do open market sales anymore. Okay, so that would work to decrease the money supply. Another method that could be used is increasing the required reserve rate. And remember, the required reserve rate is the minimum percent of deposits that a bank must hold. So for example, consider BB&T again. Maybe it has this situation. Maybe it's got $100 million in deposits and $10 million in reserves. Right now, that means this bank is right up against that 10% required reserve rate, so they're loaning out the maximum. If the Fed came in and increase this rate to, say, 12%, what that would mean is this bank would have to figure out a way to get more, basically more reserves relative to deposits. They'd have to figure out a way to get some money and hold it, okay? So what they may end up doing is, it may take them a little time. And if the Fed raised this, it wouldn't happen overnight. The banks would have a warning, so they'd be prepared for this to occur and could react accordingly. But for this example here with BB&T, they may end up still holding the minimum, right? But in this case, it's $12 million. So that means there are $2 million that can't be loaned out. So $2 million that can't go into that multiplier effect that we've been talking about. So the higher the required reserve rate, the fewer loans banks can make. All right, just like that. High required reserve rate, fewer loans, less money for society. Okay, the third thing we talked about when we were talking about increasing the money supply is the discount rate. And so I'm going to talk about this one now, but I'm going to put an X through it. This one doesn't work. You can't really decrease the money supply by adjusting the required reserve rate. Okay? So let me give you an example of why this doesn't work. So the question is, could you increase the discount rate to decrease the money supply, right? And remember, when we talked about increasing the money supply, we said the Fed could drop the discount rate below the federal funds rate. And if the discount rate is below the federal funds rate, the banks are going to borrow from the Fed, which would be new money being borrowed, thus increasing the money supply. But think about the scenario that the U.S. is in at just about any given moment. The required reserve rate is 10%, like it always is. Okay. The federal funds rate is maybe at 3%, and the discount rate is maybe at 4%. It's a pretty typical scenario for our Federal Reserve to have set up these rates. Remember, the discount rate is the rate the Fed charges, and the federal funds rate is the rate the banks charge each other, which can be manipulated by the Fed. If the Fed went in and it raised this discount rate to 10%, that would do nothing. The banks are already borrowing from other banks initially, so if the Fed increases the discount rate to 10%, it's not really going to do much of anything. Okay? So this one doesn't work, and the reason it doesn't work is because the discount rate is always above the federal funds rate, virtually always above the federal funds rate to begin with. So if the Fed raises the rate to be even higher than the federal funds rate than it was before, it does nothing because the banks continue to borrow from other banks. Okay? So this is the one that only works for increasing money supply. It can't be used to decrease the money supply. Okay, so that third one doesn't do anything. The fourth one we talked about works as you would expect. Okay? For the Fed to increase the money supply, it needs to target a low federal funds rate. To decrease the money supply, it needs to target a high federal funds rate. And the logic here is somewhat complicated, but it is the same as the logic we used before. But let's think about a high federal funds rate instead. Okay? If the federal funds rate is, say, 40%, banks are scared to borrow, so they hold extra money. They hold, what's that called when the bank holds extra money? Excess reserves. Okay? Comparatively, if the federal funds rate is 0.25%, now the banks aren't worried about borrowing at all. They're fine with borrowing, right? Because they're borrowing at so low, such low rates, it's not really scary to them. So what they do is they hold virtually no excess reserves. You can see how important excess reserves are in these discussions because that's where the bank has choices of what to do with their money. So in these two scenarios, the lower federal funds rate would lead to more money because banks would make more loans. Okay, so what you get down here is more loans, which means more money. Comparatively, if the federal funds rate is 40%, that means fewer loans and less money. So the higher the federal funds rate, the less money there will be in society, simply because of the bank's actions. Now, what does the Fed need to do to get this federal funds rate up higher? Well, you need to be able to explain that. It's something I'll probably ask on the next exam. We know what they need to do to lower the federal funds rate. So think about what they would need to do to raise the federal funds rate. That would be a good test question. Okay, so that's it for decreasing the money supply. Now this next section is something that's not in the book, but it's something I just want to talk about. So the question is, how does the Fed affect your life? And I'm going to give you a few examples of actions that the Fed makes that would affect your life. And in doing so, teach you some lessons that are in the chapter. Okay? So some of this is not in the book, but I'm going to introduce a couple of terms perhaps as we move forward that are in the book. So let me give you one example. Let's say you're about to borrow some money. Maybe you're going to borrow $300,000 finance a house. Right? Maybe you're buying a $340,000 house, putting $40,000 down, so you owe $300,000, and that's what you're borrowing. Okay? The interest rate that you're going to end up paying on this house is going to be highly correlated with what the Fed decides to do. Okay? So within this example, let's imagine one possibility. So let's say you're thinking about doing this, and right before you're going to borrow money for this house, let's say the Fed engages in a bunch of open market sales. This means the Fed is going to sell the stuff that they have, get cash, and then destroy the cash. That's why the Fed would do this, okay? It's to decrease the money supply. Perhaps they want to drive down inflation rates or drive down interest rates. I don't know what their goal would be, but let's think about how it would affect you, okay? What is this going to do? Immediately, the amount of money in society will decline. Okay? So the amount of money that's out there is going to decline. Now, how is that going to manifest itself in the market for loanable funds? How is that going to affect the market for loanable funds? It's not going to really affect the borrower's curve. Okay? Here's our quantity of loanable funds. Here's our interest rate. You guys remember this? Here's our savers. Here's our borrowers. This isn't going to affect the borrower's curve. The borrower's curve is basically based on how badly people want to borrow. And I say it won't affect it. Maybe it could. Maybe it could affect it in some way. But the much more obvious effect is the effect on savings. Okay? The simple result of this, if there's less money, there's less money to save. So the amount of savings decreases. The amount of savings decreases. Okay? So if this is where we're at to begin with, just imagining we're at equilibrium, the result here is the savers curve is going to shift left. Less savings means a shift to the left. There's less money around because the Fed just destroyed some. And so what that is going to do is it's going to drive up interest rates. Interest rates get pushed up. So how does that affect you? Well, you're now about to finance a house, you're about to borrow money at interest, and you end up getting, 4.5% instead of the 4.0% that had been available to you in the past. Okay? So the Fed has a direct impact on your life because all of you are going to end up borrowing money at some point. And also you're going to end up saving money. And it works the other way. If you're saving money, this is good. Higher interest rates means you're likely to get a higher interest rate on the money that you're saving. The reason I bring this up is to illustrate to you why this affects you personally. This isn't just a macroeconomic issue. It's also a microeconomic issue because it affects you. And you can take advantage of this information. If the Fed says they're about to do a bunch of open market sales, you should lock in an interest rate right now if you're borrowing money. Okay? Because if you know they're going to do a bunch of sales, you know the interest rates are going to go up. Conversely, if you're thinking about saving some money and you're going to buy some bonds or put your money in a CD or something like that, you should wait until after the Fed does the open market sales in this example. So you can use this information to your benefit to be a more successful person. So this is a macroeconomic issue, right? The entire market for loanable funds, but it affects you at the micro level as well. Just to illustrate one more example here, or one more possibility, still thinking about you borrowing some money for a house. And this is what it typically looks like. The Fed doesn't often come out and say, we're going to do open market sales. Instead, what they do is they talk about the federal funds rate. Remember, we said that's their number one goal. So the Fed may come out and say, that it will target a lower federal funds rate. The Fed has these meetings and they say this sort of stuff all the time. The logic is if the Fed says it, it gives people a chance to be prepared, okay? Because this will affect a lot of businesses' bottom lines and a lot of individuals' life. So if they announce it will target a low federal funds rate, what that is going to do is this will cause banks to be more aggressive. They'll be more aggressive because they know if the federal funds rate is lower, it's easier for them to borrow. It's cheaper for them to borrow. So they're going to loan out more of the money that they have and hold very little excess reserves. The result is more money and thus more savings. All right? Anytime there's more money, there's going to be more money saved. So the way this is going to affect our graph this is where we begin. Then the result is when the banks start making more loans, there's more money, there's more savings, so the savings curve shifts right, leading to a lower interest rate. So the interest rate gets driven down. So how do you use this information? Well, when the Fed says they're going to do this, if you're thinking about borrowing money, you should wait. You should wait until the federal funds rate drops so you get a lower interest rate. This is very helpful to you. And in fact, this is something I think about. I'm about to probably borrow money to buy another house. I've been buying and selling houses all the time. I don't know what's wrong with me. But what I've been thinking about is, trying to time this market. And the Fed has been raising interest rates. They've been raising the federal funds rate. So timing the market to me means do it as soon as you possibly can. Get the interest rates now because they're likely to go up in the future. The only reason I know that is because I know what the Fed is doing. So being able to anticipate that is a very good thing for you. All right, so that's one way the Fed affects you. I'll give you another example. So let's say the Fed engages in open market purchases and sales. Okay? And the way this might look is in 2018 they may do some purchases. Maybe they buy $200 billion worth of assets. A lot of times that's governmental debt. Okay? So it could be governmental debt. It could be other things. After that last recession, and I want you to know this, after the last recession, the Fed spent more than $2 trillion. And that's just a side note, but boy, that's a big side note. What that means is the Fed spent more than our federal government did to fight the Great Recession. But there's a big difference between when the Fed spends money and when the government spends money. When the government spends money, where does it get it? If they want to do expansionary fiscal policy, where does the government get it? By borrowing. So the government will go out there and borrow money. This creates debt. Let's think now instead about what the Fed might do. All right, and this is just one example. The Fed may buy $200 billion worth of items, goods, various goods, okay? The cost to the Fed is $0. This sounds strange. They purchased $200 billion worth of stuff, but it costs them no dollars. Why does it cost them no dollars? Because they don't have to get the money from somewhere. They just print it. They just create it, okay? So they can literally just type to a bank, all right, bank, you now have $1 billion for that purchase we were making, right? So if the Fed goes out and it buys a bunch of gold from some customer in Texas, it can say, hey, what's that Texas gold owner's account number? And it can just wire it directly in to that person's account. It doesn't cost them really any money at all. So this is free for the Fed to do. Okay? And then in 2019, what might happen is the Fed may sell these items. I don't know, maybe it sells them for $250 billion. The amazing thing about this is they have a couple of options, right? This is an open market sale. In a traditional sense, an open market sale means they would typically destroy the money. But what they may do instead is they may count this as profits. Okay? They've got two options. They can just wipe this money off the board and say it doesn't exist. But what if they still want this money to exist? What if they don't want to get rid of this money? Then the other thing they could do is call this revenues. And if that's the case, then what the Fed has basically done between those two transactions is generate a massive profit. And it's a profit of really close to $250 billion. Because remember, when they bought these items to begin with, they bought it with brand new money. So it didn't really cost them $200 billion, because all they had to do was just build up some pieces of paper, call up some banks, right? They didn't have to work for that money. They just created it. And when they sell the items, that's $250 billion. They can then take that money and call it revenues and generate a profit. Now, what do they do with that profit? They give it to the federal government. All right, we said the Fed is private, but they definitely have some ties to the public sector. They definitely have ties to our government. So what actually happens here is the Fed would give these profits to the government. So the Fed would give these profits to the government, and this is actually what the Fed does. They have operating expenses, right? So, some of this money in reality could end up being used to pay for employees or pay for electricity or whatever. But whatever profits they have, right? Just like any other company that has profits, they're going to do something with it. What our Fed does is they give it to the federal government. And every year, in recent times, the Fed has been giving billions of dollars to the government every year. So, how does this affect you? Well, when the government spends extra money, it causes debt. But when the Fed spends extra money, it reduces the debt. Because the Fed can typically take these transactions and turn them into profitable ventures and then turn that money over to the government, reducing the amount of debt that society has. So how does this affect you? Well, we're $20 trillion in debt or so. It'd be worse if it wasn't for the Fed and these actions that they've been doing. So this reduces the governmental debt, which should make you feel good about this outcome that we get from the Fed. Okay, and there's certainly some negatives we could say about the Fed, which is something I try to talk about in upper level classes. But from a simple standpoint, this is very beneficial. And a lot of people have said it's better for the Fed to get involved. It's better to do expansionary monetary policy than expansionary fiscal policy, because this has the ability to reduce debt, whereas expansionary fiscal policy always causes debt. Okay? And I'm going to stop here for this video. We may cover a couple more things from this chapter before we move on to chapter 14. We're getting very close to the end of this semester.